Hello and welcome to this event of the Think M.D series sponsored by the Alumni Association of the University of Notre Dame, and to this particular program on the global church. I'm Father Paul Kollman, a Holy Cross priest teaching theology here at Notre Dame in the World Religions World Church program, one of the sub areas in our theology faculty and students. And it's my delight to have been invited to join you for what we hope will be a really engaging series of conversations around the church in Africa in this part of the Global Church series. It seems we've had about 1,800 people or more participate in this series from 43 different countries. So though it's a beautiful afternoon here in South Bend, Indiana on this Easter Tuesday, I'm not sure what the weather or time is like where you are, but I hope you're well and delighted in the joy of the risen Christ if that's your faith. Otherwise, we welcome everyone. Before we begin, I'd just like to make sure I thank the sponsors for this series in particular, and they are the World Religions World Church program of the Department of Theology, as well as the College of Arts and Letters, also the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and the Tantur Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Global Gateway, and finally, the Alumni Association itself, whose indefatigable workers and staff have made this really a pleasure to organize and to prepare for. I'd also like to say that, kind of give you a sense of what's going to happen. In a few minutes, I'm going to introduce my co-host and good friend, Father David Eliaona. We're going to be going back and forth with some questions, discussing some of the materials on this part of the series. And then we're going to have a few minutes where you all can write in questions. And those questions can be submitted through the chat function. There's a link there now where you can submit those questions. And you can do that anytime, but we won't be fielding them until after our conversation has gone through a little bit. And then once that winds down, about 3:15 my time here in Eastern time in the United States, we'll be going into breakout rooms or community circles, conversation circles, and in which you'll be able to talk with one another. And Father David and I will be entering those spaces as well to interact with you. And that will wind down about 3:30, after which the Zoom call will be ending. Once again, it's really good to have you here, and I appreciate your interest in this topic. And once again, I thank the Alumni Association for organizing this and inviting me. This series on the church in Africa, I've divided into 3 parts. And this first part, I prepared 3 video presentations that I hope you've had a chance to look at and enjoy, with some accompanying readings and other materials. This first part is on the Catholic Church in Africa today. The next 2 parts are going to be on the history of Christianity in Africa, which we'll be discussing next Tuesday. And then finally, 2 Tuesdays from now, the future of the Catholic Church in Africa. But today we do want to focus on the Catholic Church in Africa today. And the presentations I sent around, to which I hope you've had some access, engage that topic around 3 subtopics: demographics, dynamism, and devotion, by which I hoped to kind of organize our thoughts around this kind of issue. And in order to help us to kind of advance into these topics about the Catholic Church in Africa today, I'm very pleased to introduce my good friend and fellow Holy Cross priest, Father David Eliaona. Father David and I have known each other since 1997 when we met in Tanzania. And he is zooming in from Tanzania, where he works with Holy Cross, teaching in a seminary there. Father David is a double domer, having got his master's in theological studies here in 2014, and just having finished his Ph.D. this last spring in 2020. His dissertation, which was a great piece of work, I was really proud to be part of it, studied the Christology of African Catholics, the ways that they think about the person and life of Jesus Christ as they live their faith. Father David, most welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to be part of these conversations in this Church in Africa, part of the Global Church series of the World Religions World Church area in the theology department. You are certainly one of the products of our area and the university of whom we are most proud. So I turn it over to you so we can get started in our back and forth conversation around some of the things raised by the materials presented, but also other questions that you, some of our other participants might have. Thanks, Father David.
Thank you so much, Father Paul, and greetings, everyone. I hope everyone is able to hear me. This is all from Tanzania, where this kind of technology is still picking up. So I'm very grateful to be part of this. And Father Paul, thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you and, being able to, discuss some of the issues and questions that maybe people may have. Actually today is the first time to be called a double domer. I didn't know about that. And now I know. Thank you so much. It was very pleasant, actually, very delightful to read some of the, most of the information that you posted on the podcast. You covered lots of material, and to me, they raised some of the very important issues for the Catholic Church in Africa. I myself, having done my research in Africa on contemporary Christology, I find that you covered immense grounds on the growth of the faith in this continent. And, I certainly could see that even when you were directing me on my dissertation. It was very inspiring. Your information, your knowledge about Christianity in Africa was really, really inspiring. So for now, I would, after I watched those presentations and read the materials, I picked up some issues and questions that I hope maybe could guide us and maybe help us to discuss this today. And I hope our time will be enough to touch some of the most important. But maybe the first question I wanted to ask, and I actually like to ask most people who have visited Africa and from the United States and have seen the practice of faith. So this question I would like also to ask you, what do you think are some of the differences that you noticed when you moved between the Catholic Church in Africa and the Catholic Church in the United States?
It's a great question, and I would invite you to reflect on it after I do a little bit, because in some ways you've had more time in the United States than I've had in Africa. So I'd love to hear your own reflections on the same question. But one of the things I would say is that the Africa Church is still young insofar as the number of generations of people that are, in which a family might have members who are Christian, might be only 1 or 4 or 5. Now, interestingly, you come from a family that's one of the earliest converts in the country of Tanzania. So your family has a particularly rich Catholic history compared to many other people in Africa who are Christian or Catholic. But most African Christians are in the maybe 3rd or 4th generation of their Christian life. As one scholar, the theologian Kwame Bediako, whom we've read together, says, in some ways, Africa is still the early church insofar as African people have learned to appropriate the truths of Christianity in a way that's comfortable to them. So they are extremely committed to their faith. Jesus and the life of the church are really important to them. And you still always get the sense that there's a dynamism and an edge of growing life in their life of faith. So celebrations on Sundays and in other feasts are really delightful. People are committed to the church in ways that are really impressive. One of the things I feel like when I return to the United States, I appreciate are simply the large number of lay people in many of the Holy Cross parishes I've participated in who have kind of advanced theological training and are prepared to be full-time ministers in the church, though not ordained or committed as lay or ordained religious. So there's a certain sense in which there's a formal theological expertise to people, to many Catholics in the United States, at least in the parishes where I've been privileged to work, that isn't quite as true in the African Catholic parishes where I've participated. But those would be some of my differences. I mean, I love moving back and forth between both places to be a member of the church and a leader in the church as a priest. So both of them feed my spirit. Yeah, how about for you? You've spent a lot of your time on campus here. So Notre Dame is a particular microcosm of the Catholic Church in the United States, but not an irrelevant.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question.
Correct, and you're right. I personally am a 4th generation Catholic, and there's already a 5th generation coming up. in my family. As you would know that, the Puritan missionaries, when they came to East Africa, they started at the coast of East Africa and moved all the way up to Mount Kilimanjaro and established my home parish. And my great grandfather, was one of those who were converted at the, at that time. I grew up Catholic, and it was really interesting, to come into the United States and being able to spend that much time, even though it was just, for school. But I was able to participate, in faith practices, celebrating Mass, being able to, walk in different groups or classes to be able to say something about African Christianity and how faith is practiced here. And certainly, I know one of the things that we're going to be talking about later is small Christian community. It's one aspect that I certainly missed while I was in the United States, because it's a big practice, especially in our dioceses and Catholic communities here. But as you said, I found a truly profound understanding of faith among among Christians. While if I am here, and I hope I'm not breaking.
You're breaking up a little bit. I wonder if you want to get rid of your screen so that we can save your voice.
Okay, but can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So, when if I was celebrating Mass here and I had to preach, I wouldn't care so much about how much time I'm going to preach, as long as I just want to pass my message. So I came to the United States, and everywhere I was invited, the first thing I would ask is, how long do you preach here? And they'll say, well, between 7 and 12 minutes. And I'll say, I think maybe 25 minutes to 40 will be my take. And then, of course, with time, I had to begin to cut down to make sure that, my homily is all contained within the few minutes. But then I had to begin to learn how to make my homilies effective within those minutes. Whereas now I came back here, and now I'm struggling to reverse the whole process.
To elaborate your thought.
Yes, because we just finished the Easter Triduum, and I've been preaching in all those three days, and you can just try to imagine how I was struggling to change from English to back to preaching in Swahili, and again to make sure that my homilies are so I would say in both sides there are lots of things to appreciate. Of course, there's cultural shock. But I think, some of the differences that I found are those that, I can easily mention. Yeah. So maybe with that, I may maybe throw in just one more question. What for you, what are some of the biggest challenges that you think are facing the Catholic Church, especially in places that you know well? So certainly the United States is one of those, but also you were in Africa, but you were in East Africa.
Yeah.
And you were in 3 different countries in East Africa, and that is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the church, the Catholic Church, in some of those places?
Great, thank you. Yeah, and about all 3 of those countries too, and you also spent some time of your formation in Ghana and West Africa, so you even have a richer, larger geographic spread and insight. But let me begin by just saying, I think the church everywhere in the world always needs to maintain its credibility by the integrity of its leaders and its institutions. I mean, in the United States, over the last 20 years, we've suffered that greatly due to the clergy sex abuse crisis, and it's an ongoing crisis, something that we all care about, have grieved deeply, and hopefully we've made steps in the right direction towards avoiding the worst abuses of the past. But there's still an ongoing challenge of accountability in order to regain credibility. In Africa, I think the value of the integrity of institutions is equally important and valued by Catholics themselves. And there are different ways that that's measured. I mean, one is simply the prominence of the Catholic Church in service provision in health and education, which I mentioned in presentations I made that some of you folks might have been able to witness. So the church's institutions of school and healthcare touch many more people than similarly placed Catholic institutions in this country, which also touch millions, but not as high a percentage as in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, because the Catholic Church would be just the largest single service provider of those services in lots of places. So integrity is really a challenge.
Correct.
And that means kind of holding people accountable, developing kind of structures of accountability so that bishops learn how to help become people who know how to run things financially and in other sorts of ways that are clear and not hidden in the ways they're run, that invite people with skills and integrity to join them in managing and leadership. And so this is a challenge for the African church. I think it's a challenge for the church everywhere, but particularly a challenge in the African church because you want to have really, really well prepared and people of virtue to manage these institutions.
Correct.
I think that's a big challenge. I mean, when I think about the Congregation of Holy Cross, as well as the Sisters of the Holy Cross, whom we know well, who work with us in Africa, in East Africa and West Africa, that's a big challenge for us. The institutions we manage, healthcare and lots of educational institutions and parishes, we want them to be beacons of integrity. And when we fall down or fail to live up to that, it hurts the church's witness. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, David.
Yeah, so that's actually should be one of the challenges that I find. But and another challenge that actually I've been discussing with some of my fellow priests here is, and this is something that we begin to see more and more of it, on these current days, is especially the lack of strong catechesis. Because as you would well know that Africa is now at a stage where lots of things are developing so fast, especially in the economies, and so most of the our missions and church related projects are mostly in establishing institutions, especially facilities. So there are lots of priests and religious who involve themselves so deeply into trying to develop such things at the expense of the right catechesis for the next generation that is coming up. And actually that's a worrying thing. We find it's a big challenge because you find lots of priests and religious who are trying to divide themselves between trying to do the projects at the same time trying to raise the right to put the right catechesis through the coming up generations. Yeah.
In the midst of that, it seems like the empowerment and education of lay people to kind of create catechetical networks that really can serve to educate the young and others who don't know as much as they would want is really important.
It is, yes, yeah. That's and as you would remember, that's one of the things that I faced actually when I was doing my research on Christology, because you would take some time before you can actually grab the right knowledge of Christology from a Christian, and especially the younger generation. They would throw answers here and there, but to get the right information about the knowledge they have would be a little challenging, because it all begins from catechesis, and the right catechesis is important, plus continuing catechesis. So, but fortunately, we have all these other groups that are coming up, and maybe we can talk about that a little later, but which are trying in their own level to instill the right catechesis among the Christians. So number-wise, yes, they are growing in numbers, just like what you showed in the demographics, and it's very, very impressive on how you were able to capture that. But of course, with number comes also the right foundation for faith. Yeah.
I was impressed in your dissertation, David, the way you sort of helped me understand in a new way. There's an old kind of approach to African Christianity that says the key thing is that African Christians need to kind of bring their culture and their faith together. And I thought that your research, especially with young people in central Tanzania, where you did your field work, showed that a lot of the problems were that even these young people don't know their traditional culture very well.
Right. Yeah.
Because of the fast moving pace of life as Africa changes so dramatically with all of us, social media realities, that it's not only Christianity that has trouble fixing with the culture, it's culture that has trouble standing still enough to make sense of it so that people feel properly oriented in the world.
There's so many times that, there are so many times as I'm doing my research, and I was, growing up in Africa myself, knowing that, okay, I grew up in a culture that I understand and I know my Christianity and I know how to kind of, mingle through that, the whole process of the church process of enculturation and how it works. And then I get to a point to see that it actually is not working exactly that way. There's almost like, a whole new culture that is actually cropping up. And there are lots of youth and new generation that are actually picking up a culture that, it's not the one that I knew very well. And of course, with that, even when they're walking in their faith, they get to understand some of the concepts in the way that they understand them. So it's all kind of mitigated new culture coming up. Yeah, and it does help, especially for people who come to the sense to know, okay, some things are changing and I still need to understand my faith in this way. It does help them, to come up to express, their faith and how they know about Christ and things like those. So yeah, that was very interesting. Yeah.
One of the things I think about your own experience, I mean, you would have grown up in the late 70s, late 60s and early 70s. Correct. And the rate of social change in Eastern Africa has been so immense the last 10 or 15 years that in some ways it's a whole different world.
That's very true. Yeah.
And your home was also a place with very strong Catholic identity. I've been there. It's a place where the Catholic Church is very established and strong. And but even today it's probably got other kinds of Christians around.
That's true.
Growing up smaller churches, and other parts of Africa don't have the strong Catholic identity that the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, where you grew up, do.
That's very true. Yeah. And so with that, maybe I had another question. I hope maybe you can try to talk a little bit about this, because I wanted to ask, how does the Catholic Church vary between rural areas and urban areas? I know in your research, this is part of what you did. Maybe you can talk about that in the African context and see how,
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I'd like to hear from you on this. When I went to East Africa the first time, I went to a city, Nairobi, Kenya. The place, I lived in Dandora, which was one of the subjects of one of the videos I shared with folks. And that parish was very dynamic, but very diverse ethnically. People from all over different parts of Kenya and other parts of Africa were living in a place of 150,000 or 200,000 people. And in rural Africa, much of rural Africa would be much more ethnically homogeneous. Many rural areas will have a large number of a single ethnic group. So there's a sense of solidity and shared language and culture that wouldn't be true in urban settings. And the Catholic Church is different in those places. In a rural setting, the Catholic Church can really adapt to a certain kind of culture in a very profound way, oriented around local rituals with meaning, traditional practices, language, etc. Whereas in the city, you are sort of building something anew from diverse people. And so that's one of the contrasts I would think, and it's a challenge for church ministers. It's one of the things, to get to one of your early questions, where small Christian communities can really play an important role. And I'd love to hear you talk some about your experience of them, what in Swahili, Jumuiya Ndogo Ndogo, small Christian communities in different places in Africa.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that, because I was going to connect these two questions, because my next question actually was going to talk about small Christian communities. And, that's where I actually found, the major differences between, how the church varies between rural and urban areas. What actually identifies the differences between them is mostly in the practice of the small Christian communities. People who live in rural areas are maybe mostly farmers, and they do mostly, household work. They are the way of how they connect to each other, because they're neighbors, close neighbors, is it's just very simple. They don't have to have times for their meetings announced in the church for them to know when we're supposed to meet. They're more personable, they're more approachable, and people who live in cities, because most of them work, maybe they're civil servants and they work in different business. The times for the meetings has to be announced in the church for them to know exactly who we meet and whose house are we going to be hosted in. And of course, even when you sit in such meetings, you will know, you can see how people think differently because of the different style, lifestyles. So probably that's one of the differences that you see between rural and urban Christians. But certainly, if I can base a little bit on the concept of the small Christian communities, this actually has been the root that holds together the Catholic Church, especially in East and Central Africa, where I have the experience. It's and maybe you can also talk a little bit of what you have found about small Christian communities. But it's so important that I was trying to explain to some of my friends in the United States how small Christian communities work, and they looked at me like, that won't work here. Because I said, well, you want to baptize a child, the parish priest will give you a form and you'll take it to the small Christian community, and families within small Christian communities will fill up to say, yes, you go to church, yes, you contribute to, to this, that, and the other, and yes, we approve of him or her to baptize their child. And if they say no to 3 of those questions, the pastor will have a hard time baptizing your child. And that's how the church grows here, because it's a connection. It's being able to say, we take responsibility of raising this child in faith. I don't know if you have the same.
This is a great question. I mean, I do think small group activities have been very important in the Catholic Church in this country too, but they've taken different sorts of forms. For instance, there were like sodalities, which women in parishes would participate in, and there sometimes would be a men's club that men would participate in various parishes and have their own activities. But the difference would be that in a small Christian community, it's a pretty much weekly meeting with reflection on the scriptures that on Sunday would be preached about and heard in the liturgy at Sunday Mass. And in addition, I think the best small Christian communities also try to think about the challenges they're facing in their neighborhoods, at least in urban settings, and try to address them. So besides being simply prayer groups, they also become places of dynamic efforts for justice and peace, because they're living very close to some of the issues they face. In Dandora, the parish where you and I have both spent some time,
correct, yeah.
We know that, for instance, policing is an issue there. We know that the city of Nairobi dumps a lot of its garbage from the whole city over into that part of the metropolitan area. So the people of Dandora have been able to organize to address problems of policing or garbage disposal and problems of noise and crime. And small Christian communities have been like vessels for those kinds of responses that are collective. Yeah. And you make a very good point. They're also the ways that the church has like a relational depth for many of its members in relationship to the parish. Yeah. So Christians hold each other accountable for the faith formation of their children, for their regular participation in worship, for their generous support of one another. There's an interdependence that small Christian communities seek to help promote. Now, in the individualistic culture that I grew up in, that would feel like intrusive for many people, like, not sure I want that. But my own sense is it's very comfortable for many African Catholics.
It is, yes. We feel comfortable with that because, I feel comfortable walking into the parish and the pastor would say, which small Christian community do you come from? And once I mentioned the name, the pastor would know everyone else around me because they'll be able to ask, so whose son are you? And of course, they'll be able to locate me right away. Yeah. And one of the things that I actually wanted to ask you is, do you think maybe in the Christian practice within the United States, is there anything even close to this, to small Christian communities?
I think
anything that helps, like the parish to,
yeah, the closest comes when parishes try to do renewal. Some of the listeners here and participants will have been part of Catholic renewal efforts in their parishes around something like Christ Renews His Parish. There are other kinds of renewal programs. Those work through small groups as well, very often. And sometimes parishes have sought to have those programs persist once the period of parish renewal is over. But I don't think there's as much widespread effort to kind of create these kinds of local communities of faith sharing and faith formation and kind of Christian practice together. Again, there's lots of small group stuff. People pray together in beautiful ways. And I think even about Catholic secondary schools, sometimes there's groups of students who will participate together in social action or kind of worship service together or personal prayer, spirituality. So it's not as if people don't want to be connected to other believers. I don't think, as a structure for a parish, I do think small Christian communities in Africa, and especially Eastern Africa, are pretty unique.
Yeah. And I said I wouldn't know much, even with my 9 years staying in the United States. I wouldn't know much because I didn't, work in a parish. But the system that I see at the University of Notre Dame, I think it's something to be very commended. I just wish maybe in the future we can do something like that and at some of our institutions here in East Africa.
You mean like the residence halls and that kind of thing?
The residence halls, yes. I was blessed to, stay in Keo Hall for 2 years and Pasquarella West for three years. That was awesome. And it was, I felt like, I'm having my own small Christian community. It was much larger, of course, but, it was very nice to be able to connect with everyone and get to know people very closely. So that was really quite something. Yeah,
and I live in O'Neill Family Hall, and I agree. It's nice to be able to live with students. Sometimes on Friday and Saturday nights, it gets a little noisy, but we get over it. So
I don't know how we're doing time-wise.
We've got a couple minutes, 1 minute before we want to start addressing questions. Should we start addressing the questions they've asked, David?
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can do that.
Yeah, I've got access to them. So a couple. David, I'm going to just throw them out there and just list all of them, okay? And then we can sort of take them up as we would wish. So the first one talks about the role of women, and I assume in the church, in Africa and the US, and similarities and differences. So the second...
Can you repeat that? My connection is...
Oh yeah, sorry. Can you comment on the role of women and differences between Africa and the US?
Okay.
The second question.
Do you want me to go?
No, let me put them all out there and then we can take them up as we're able. The second question asks about the differences between the Catholic Church in Ghana and East Africa. And the question writer has a pastor, a Ghanaian Spiritan is her pastor or his pastor. So Ghana and East Africa, that would be a good one for you to maybe answer. There's a question about metrics on mass and service attendance across demographics. We'll kind of think about that one. Finally, there's a question about catechesis, whether it's in small group settings or other kinds of settings. We can talk about that. Then there's a question, differences around Catholic missionary and evangelization efforts between the church in Africa and the US. And how do other Christian faith traditions evangelize in Africa? And then there's also a question of permanent deacons as part of the African Catholic tradition. So David, would you want to start talking a little bit about what you noticed about the church in Ghana versus the US?
So I was in Ghana, that was 20 years ago. I did my novitiate there. And I know so much can change, within 20 years. But first of all, I want to be able to say I love the liturgies in Ghana. There's lots of singing and dancing and lots of culture that is actually that is incorporated in the liturgy, which is really, really something. Even 20 years have passed, but I can still sing some of the hymns that they sing in the liturgy. Certainly, there's a difference, and the difference I think will be especially in first of all, it's in liturgical practices. I'm pretty sure that there's some parishes maybe in the United States which maybe have multicultural population that would try to incorporate some of the practices coming from different places around the world. Because Catholicism is global. Ghana is a country that is still very, very deeply embedded in its own culture, and so most of the things will be celebrated in the local language. I keep saying this every time I talk about Ghana. On my first week when I was there, we went to Kumasi, and the Archbishop of Kumasi was celebrating Mass to institute Eucharistic ministers. And that Mass lasted for almost 4 hours. I remember that very, very clearly. But it was all in Twi, which is the local language. And I was just 1 week in Ghana, and I didn't understand a word throughout Mass. But I knew I was in Mass, and I participated. Whereas if I come to the United States, I said, first thing I know, I'm not going to be in a Mass that will take 4 hours. And secondly, I probably will understand almost everything, just because I am able to speak English. But there are certainly some things that I'll be able to, I'll enjoy very much, being in the liturgy in the United States, and certainly being from the African background, I really enjoyed, the liturgy in Ghana. I'm not so sure whether I understood the question very well, but at least just to be able to tell the little differences. Yeah,
that's great. Would you want to talk a little bit about your impressions of the different similarities and differences about how women participate in the church in Africa and here? And I can talk a little bit too about that.
Yes, yeah. So, one of the things that we have in the Catholic Church here in East Africa is those church-sponsored groups. And we have like the Catholic Women Association, the Catholic Men Association, the Catholic Youth Association. And one of the strongest is the Catholic Women Association. They gather in church compounds, and maybe once or twice every week. They have very strong leadership. Of course, they have kind of self-help programs that are amongst themselves to help each other, in their families. They call for seminars, different kinds of seminars to empower themselves. But while they're doing that, they're also a strong force to reckon actually in the church community, because they're with a strong unity and self-help, they're able to let me turn my video on. I hope now you can hear me well.
Yeah, we can. That's good.
Yeah. So with that, they're really able to help and support the church community. Several times you would hear pastors, talking about different church projects, and they'll say, okay, fine, we have a whole Christian community here to come together to help in this project, but we certainly would want, the Catholic Women Association to put a lot in this, and they have been able to do that very well. Certainly there is a difference between how maybe Catholic women operate in the churches in East Africa and those in the United States. As again, I would say my experience with the United States is a little limited because I didn't work in a parish setup, but in whatever parish I was able to go, I saw how lots of women actually participate. They take a lead in some of this, the works that I've done in the parish. They take leadership. They certainly help and support the church in many different ways. I wasn't able to see any group that actually calls themselves the Catholic Women Association, maybe with kind of a, an organized leadership and, membership. But certainly that's something that happens in the church in East Africa. We have those groups, and they are actually present and active in almost every parish community.
Yeah. One of the things that is these days a difference, in some ways, the Catholic Church in East Africa is like the Catholic Church in the United States, and maybe in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when there were large numbers of women religious, nuns, yes, sisters, active in ministry. And so the prominence of Catholic sisters in lots of Eastern African Catholic experience would differentiate that from today's experience in the United States. Certainly there are some places where there are lots of Catholic women religious still active in the United States, but fewer than before, fewer than 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And so that would be another difference. In 2 weeks from today, David will be replaced by a current PhD student, Sister Edla Queen Shivachi, a Kenyan sister. So we'll hear more from her, but she'll be able to talk about this kind of question, especially as we look to the future of the Catholic Church in East Africa. But for today, my own sense is that leadership by women takes different forms in different places, but in both places, it's pretty prominent. And there are prominent women leaders. I'm on a board of Tangaza with a couple of very strong Catholic women. One is a former member of Parliament of Kenya, and another is a Catholic sister. And they're just extremely capable Catholic leaders of the Catholic Church in Kenya. And it's a pleasure to serve on this board with them. So we don't have very much time, David. I'm wondering whether we might want to address the question of catechesis, like how it happens that people do get catechized in most of Eastern Africa now.
Yeah, so, first of all, and, every time you say catechesis, it touches the core of my heart, because I know that's the strongest part of the church. It's actually, for me, it's like the heartbeat. It's that actually makes for the future of the church. And we miss that part. We actually miss the next generation. In East Africa, and I would say this for sure because, all the countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, where we work, this is something that we've seen. We have catechesis for children who are, growing up. And so when they're just starting primary school, they have 2 or 3 years of preparation before. Of course, most of them are baptized as infants, but they have to go through the catechism, what you would call in the United States C.C.D. I think that's their program. Yeah. So they have 2 or 3 years of preparation before they can receive their first Holy Communion, and then they'll have 1 more year before they can receive the sacrament of confirmation. That would be the normal, the regular way of how to begin to teach catechism. Most of it is done actually by rote memorization. I still remember, I can almost see the face of the nun who taught me catechism, and she told me, repeat this and repeat this. And now I'm able to stand in front of the church preaching, and sometimes I can ask a question, what is sacrament? And I will remember the answer that I was given. But now, after I studied theology, I'm able even to expand that same answer that I was told to memorize, and it begins to make so much meaning. And I'm able to, to explain that to, the congregation that I'm preaching to. But that's how catechism is taught. Now, of course, there's continuous catechesis, and continuous catechesis is done, and I think that's what the question is actually aiming at. How is catechesis how is it? So it's through continuous catechesis. And continuous catechesis is done now through these different church-sponsored groupings and guilds. Because as you gather in different group, maybe you are a member of the Catholic Women Association or the Catholic Youth Association, there are several seminars and programs that are arranged throughout the year for such groups to have somebody to come and speak to them about their faith. And they can raise some of the issues and important questions that maybe, still don't make sense to them. And if they get maybe somebody who is very good to know exactly what they're asking for, they get, to get all answers about this. So that's how continuous catechesis is done. And of course, with preaching and what the priests do at the church, that's all that helps. Yeah.
Yeah. Father David, I think we're going to go into our conversation circles now, the breakout rooms that are going to be set up for us. I just want to thank you very much for joining us, because we won't be rejoining together with all the rest of the group, but I'm so appreciative that you took your evening. It's evening there in Arusha, Tanzania.
Right, it's 10:15 now.
Yeah, right. So get a good night's rest. You probably teach tomorrow like I do. Thank you so much. I'm here in O'Neill Family Hall, so know that the dorm that you lived in is right next door to me. So, thanks for serving ND this way in the community of our learners and teachers that we seek to create through Think ND. So now I think we'll go to our breakout rooms. Thanks so much, everybody. And Father David and I will be joining some of those rooms as well.